Thank you all very much indeed for coming along to today's seminar. Great to see so many colleagues. I guess the title of this might have intrigued you in the light of the circumstances in which we've all been working recently. But in fact, this is a paper that goes back about 5 years and came out of a EPSRC funded project called the Digital Brain Switch, and was a joint project across 4 universities. So this phenomenon that I'm going to talk about today has been a long time in sort of development, as it were, but has become incredibly pertinent in the current situation, as I said, in which we find ourselves in lockdown. So it is in fact a paper which is about to appear in the journal Work, Employment and Society, and it's co-written with my collaborator Gillian Simon at Royal Holloway. It will be an open access paper, and it will be part of the SAGE COVID hub of papers that have something interesting to say about our current work conditions. Although, as I said, it actually comes from a time period before the pandemic, if we can cast our minds back and remember what that was like. So a quick overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm situating this topic within a sort of frame of flexible work. So I'll be looking at that very briefly and sort of critiquing some of what underpins the notion of flexible work, and also introducing the notion of invisible work. I'll introduce the Digital Brain Switch project, and of course the topic of Digi-Housekeeping, or the phenomenon of Digi-Housekeeping, which is really the main thrust of today's talk. And then spend some time having kind of explained what it is, what that means, how it happens, and why I think this is important. Now, interspersed in this, I'm going to ask Alice to facilitate a couple of quick polls, and the first one is coming up now. So what I'd be interested in your reflections on is whether you think these following activities are work. Things like emptying your bins, putting away clean laundry, planning meals, buying groceries. I've given you 5 options for what you might think in terms of whether you think these are work activities, and also whether you do all or some of them yourself. So the responses could be yes, and I do all or some of them myself. Yes, but somebody does all or some of them for me. Sort of, but these aren't quite real work. It depends. And no, absolutely, they're not work. So if you haven't voted yet, please do so. I'd be very interested to see the responses. Okay. So as I said, I'm positioning this talk against a background of sort of flexible working, which was always a possibility within the UK, because the government, there's a kind of legal right to request flexible working, and not just for parents and carers within England and Wales. And government describe flexible working as a way of working that suits an employee's needs. Well, we'll think whether that's an accurate reflection of what flexible working is in a moment. But you can't have failed to notice the headlines that have been appearing in the last few weeks, as we've all been working from home, around flexible working will become the norm after lockdown, say 2 or 3 organisations. Different ways of working, like 4-day weeks. So there's been a lot of debate about whether flexible working measures will be increased and more prevalent, but certainly for the foreseeable future, quite a lot of us are going to be working at home, which is kind of part of what might make up flexible working. And COVID-19 may prompt a move to a more permanent sort of remote or home working situation. Even if it doesn't, our study indicates the presence of the phenomenon of Digi-Housekeeping across a range of contemporary work arrangements. So in a sense, the phenomenon I'm going to describe doesn't rely on major changes following COVID, but it does look as if there might be some changes. So just flagging that up. As I've also said, however, we should critique what exactly flexible working is. It is, as I said, often positioned as a benefit to suit the employee, but research indicates it's also associated with feelings of reciprocity, on the grounds that if you've been given a benefit, you owe your employer something in return, or feelings of privilege, and therefore it tends to be associated with work intensification. So maybe not entirely something which is only for the benefit of the individual. We also see in research the discourse of the flexible worker becoming a sort of idealized identity at a quite individual level, the person who is able to work flexibly. And obviously that phenomenon has been enhanced and made possible through digital communication technology. And this idealized identity includes even students thinking about their sort of future graduate worker of tomorrow identity. The ability to work flexibly has been found as part of the sort of discourse around what employers are looking for. And particular types of work that have been promoted very heavily in recent years, like self-employment and entrepreneurship, are often positioned as the kind of epitome of flexible working. But what we don't have so much is any research that tells us about the lived experience and what resources are required to perform flexibility. And so the work of flexibility is much more of an unknown quantity. At this point, we're going to have a second poll, and the options for it will be the same, but a different set of activities. And so I'd like you to reflect on whether you think these activities, like deleting junk emails, setting up folders on your laptop or PC, charging your mobile, buying software, troubleshooting things that go wrong with technology, are these work? One of the characteristics of the tasks that I've just displayed on screen is that they're quite invisible, at least to other people, and maybe they were hitherto invisible to you. The concept of invisible labour is described as work that's economically devalued, and that can be through a combination of cultural, legal, and spatial dynamics. In other words, real work takes place in public, it's regulated and contracted, it involves production, and tends to be theorized within economics. Invisible work, often unpaid, often characterized as mundane and undertaken in private, is therefore often seen not as real work. And as I said, associated with the private domain, largely unregulated and a site of reproduction. In other words, it's necessary to maintain the productive economy. If we didn't go home and cook ourselves dinner in the evening, we wouldn't be much use at work the next day. But otherwise it falls outside, or has traditionally fallen outside, the economic model of labour. Of course, there's been a debate for many decades around housework, and the campaign for wages for housework, very unsuccessful campaign for wages for housework, has gone on for a long time. And the very first time I presented on this particular topic of Digi-Housekeeping, I had a slide that said housework has always fallen outside of economic analysis. And that very morning, the ONS published a piece which attempted for the first time to put a value on sort of the work that's done within the home, which came out at about £32,000 a year per household. So actually, the moment you start bringing in some economic analysis, the figures get quite interesting. And obviously, along the same way as various technologies have been introduced in respect of housework in the name of efficiency, things like dishwashers and washing machines, and these then, of course, increase standards in terms of what are acceptably clean clothes. In the time of washing machines is very much higher than the acceptable standard of clean clothes in the time of mangles and wash tubs. So digital technologies have been introduced and are positioned as enabling more flexible working. And so what counts as being the sort of flexible and connected employee, the expectations around that have likewise shifted. And just as domestic technologies give rise to new forms of housework, like loading and unloading the dishwasher, so digital housekeeping has been observed. And there's one paper from 2015 by Kennedy and colleagues that talked about digital housekeeping in the context of the work that was required to maintain an internet connection in the domestic home, work that they described as being sort of gendered, in that it tended to be men who took on that function. Now, things played out rather differently in this study. So, is this a recognizable phenomenon? This is Jez. I'm so sorry I can't introduce the fantastic participants of the Digital Brain Switch in video form. It's the first time I've ever presented any paper from this project without the ability to be able to present video data. But this is Jez. He's one of the social entrepreneurs who made up our participants, and he says, "It's my first email download and look what I've got. It's a full screen of emails to deal with. A lot of them are rubbish, but you've still got to sort the rubbish." And that and a number of other comments and videos from the participants was what gave rise to the idea that there was a phenomenon going on that was worthy of further investigation. Now, that wasn't really what the Digital Brain Switch study was all about. It was, as I said, an EPSRC study. The aim was to investigate how we manage work-life boundary transitions or switching in the digital age. In other words, the effect that digital technology had on our ability to kind of switch between different aspects of our lives. And it was a combined visual methodology, the idea being to kind of capture the complexity of everyday life and these transitions. So we asked participants to keep video diaries for 7 days and to capture switches, which they defined what made a switch for them between different aspects of their lives, and to record a commentary of what was going on. And we gave them these digital recorders so that they had those to navigate in addition to their own existing digital technology, so that we didn't ask them to use their own phones, because that would have meant missing out on their phone usage. And then we followed that up with narrative interviews in which we talked a little bit more about their roles, their life history, invited them to review the video data with us. And the idea was to utilize the implicit knowledge that they had of their own everyday practices, focusing on the really ordinary, mundane, everyday activities. And the idea was that this could contribute to a better understanding of how we negotiate these transitions between different domains in our everyday lives at a very detailed level. As I've mentioned, we had social entrepreneurs, university students, and office workers making up our UK-based sample. We had 15 people in each category, and the idea, they were selected with having potentially different relationships with sort of work-life boundaries. The idea being that the social entrepreneurs who would be, in many cases, kind of following the idea of self-employment, entrepreneurship in pursuit of a social good, would probably be mostly home-based, would have perhaps quite minimal boundaries around sort of work and life, and be self-managed. The students, who were a younger demographic, 18 to 24, obviously the graduate workers of tomorrow, most of those were based in university halls of residence or rented flat shares, perhaps with a blended identity, but learning about boundaries between different aspects of their lives and learning about employability. And the office workers, who we thought would have more fixed boundaries, would be subject to employer stipulations around technology and systems, and routines would be largely office-based. In fact, it turned out that every single one of them had some kind of flexible working as part of their employment, whether it was compressed hours, job share, late start, lots of different variations, work from home one day, that sort of thing. But that shows, in a sense, the extent to which flexible working was embedded across all three participant groups, and that wasn't even our intention, but sometimes things work out for the best. In terms of data analysis, we use template analysis, which is quite a flexible tool. And as I said, Digi-Housekeeping was an emergent concept from the video data. I had the task of looking at the video data when it came back from the participants, and I noticed, sometimes without commentary, people doing tasks, setting things up when they arrived in the office in the morning, that could take minutes and was not necessarily always explained in any form of commentary by the participants. And I also noticed the use of housekeeping related metaphors when people talked about these tasks. One filmed himself sweeping up the leaves in his partner's garden, and as he was chatting to us in the video, he said, this is like clearing my inbox, except the leaves will be finite eventually. They will stop falling off the trees, whereas the emails coming into my inbox won't ever stop. And Jez, as we saw in the earlier slide, talked about sorting the rubbish. So there were plenty of metaphors. Yes, plenty of metaphors that invoked sort of housework and housekeeping. And so we had a sufficiently flexible analytic strategy that enabled us to then go back through, look at task content, the context in which these occurrences of Digi-Housekeeping were taking place, and what the participants talked about these things. And we didn't really spot it in time to be able to incorporate it explicitly into the interviews, although we did touch on some of that more by luck than planning, because, as I said, it emerged over time. But we then built up through a sort of coding process that was very inductive and recursive, what we've identified as the 5 core tasks of Digi-Housekeeping, each mapping onto a different aspect of domestic housekeeping. And these are the 5 tasks of Digi-Housekeeping. It's worth giving a general definition, which is that we saw Digi-Housekeeping overall as the invisible work required to support and sustain flexible working. And then the 5 individual tasks we have are clearing, this decluttering rubbish like junk emails, clearing digital space in cloud-based accounts and on devices. And it was distinguished by participants from real work, but often preparatory to it. Often this was the first task of the day when people sat down at their computers. And here we have I'm going to read some quotes since I can't show you them in video. When I come into my work email, says Jane, a social entrepreneur, this is just annoying and a waste of time. I just have to go through and delete 34 emails. Most of it is junk, kind of annoying most of the time, but there you go. And I'm not sure that I'm fully displaying the frustration that Jane felt at the necessity as a social entrepreneur, somebody self-employed who had to do this task every day. Interesting, quite a lot of participants emerged from their bathrooms saying that they had been taking a shower and had deleted a lot of emails whilst in the shower. I suspect they probably weren't actually showering, but there was quite a nice synergy between the idea of them cleaning up their devices and cleaning themselves. And so we also noticed how small amounts of time were used by participants to do Digi-Housekeeping tasks, and they enjoyed the efficiency of that. The second task is sorting, setting up and maintaining storage and task systems, finding emails, putting things into kind of meaningful locations, having to-do lists, databases, and folders. These were activities that create an infrastructure for real work. but weren't necessarily positioned as work itself. So Michael says, I have lots of folders in my email account. As stuff comes in, I throw it into folders, and I have urgent level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. Yes, gosh, I couldn't do that. I don't think I'd ever get to level 4. Preparing is the third one. So this is preparing devices, software and systems through maintenance, reinstalling software, keeping the devices synced, charged, and made ready for primarily mobile use. So these are activities that ensure that real work can be engaged in anytime, anywhere. Participants lamented the difficulties, for example, in syncing between different devices if they accessed mail from one device and then deleted things and then logged on a different device and found that it hadn't synced. So the way in which things were configured also meant some duplication of tasks. Provisioning, very self-evident. Buying digital equipment and related accessories, software system, replacing, upgrading when things got lost, broke down, needed to be brought up to date. And one of our students said, I've lost one phone and I've broken about 5 until my dad finally gave me his old phone. So I bought a very nice cover for it, and then when we went out, I lost the front cover for it. So now it keeps popping out, so now I need to go and buy a new cover. And the last task is troubleshooting. I'm sure this will resonate. Addressing problems with technology, personal devices, routers, connectivity software, including what we've described as moments of creative adaptation. So in other words, when things went wrong, people, literally sort of worked their way through a solution to enable them to carry on working. So these either anticipate problems or are in the moment sort of adaptation to problems that take place. So one of our office workers, Tina, said, I've had a few technical hitches. It's been a nuisance having no laptop lead, which he'd left behind, which is why I couldn't access the shared drive. So I ended up using the phone and email through Outlook web access. Another participant working at her mother's house briefly found that there was no internet connection, so she devised a method of driving around to her sister's house to download emails and other things. So what does all this mean? As I said, Digi-Housekeeping is the invisible infrastructural work associated with the digital technologies that sustain flexible working and form part of this unanticipated and unacknowledged resource that's required for flexible working. In other words, if you're going to work flexibly, these are the things you need to have in place, and these are the tasks that you need to do to support it. And very emblematic of processes of contemporary work practice through which labour is othered as not real work, as in the case over many, many centuries of domestic housework. And we thought, how is this taking place? How is this being achieved? It's a phenomenon that we see, for example, not just in connection with domestic housework, to extend beyond that metaphor, but in the atomization of jobs. I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, there was quite a scandal around care workers who were paid for the time in which they were actually delivering care to individual patients, but not for the time driving between those appointments. And that atomization of their job meant that some parts of how they were able to deliver their work and care were not regarded as real work and were not financially rewarded. So we identified 3 processes. I do apologise for the fact that we've ended up calling the first one responsibilitization or something. The point being, Digi-Housekeeping was constructed as a matter of individual responsibility, required to make flexible working operate for each individual. And that resonates with this idea of flexible working and working in a flexible way as being seen as some kind of benefit. It normalizes the positioning of flexible working as almost a luxury and a privilege, rather than as a necessity for managing work-life demands. And therefore, it was accepted that you would have to do this Digi-Housekeeping as a necessary part of it. In terms of how that played out for our three groups, the social entrepreneurs found that they were responsible for doing additional work that couldn't be charged to their clients. For office workers, they were responsible to work in their own time to resolve often organizationally imposed digital issues, and I'll give an example of that. And university students found that they were responsible for learning and acquiring these kind of digital and the associated planning skills around carrying out digital housekeeping. So the example I want to give is of Kath, who worked a flexible part-time job involving a job share. And she was at home using her laptop on a non-work day. And she says, okay, I'm just checking my work emails using the Outlook web app from home. Oh, my mailbox is almost full, so I'll probably just have a quick 5 minutes clear out of junk mail and stuff while I'm here. So although she's officially not at work, not only did Kath read some work emails, she undertook a Digi-Housekeeping task, unplanned, to avoid her inbox getting clogged up and to allow future real work to take place. The fact that she says, I'll just spend a quick 5 minutes, devalues the activity by downplaying the amount of time that it's going to take. And additionally, clearing the inbox in the first place was only made necessary because of an organizational size limit on her inbox. So in other words, the organization created a situation but takes no responsibility for resolving it. And these tasks are completed on days which are not regarded as real work days. And insofar as she might have done these tasks within office hours, one could argue that that might then overall reduce her sort of productive work time. So it ends up being seen as not real work, not done on a real work day, but in her own time. The second process is personalization. And this is such an interesting and potentially different between digital housekeeping and domestic housekeeping. The digital devices are used for both work and leisure, personal and work. So engagement with them is often quite personalized. We spend quite a lot of time making our sort of mobile phone or tablet or laptop kind of work for us in terms of what we put on it and how we arrange it. And it means that with particularly security settings and passwords and things like that, most Digi-Housekeeping tasks can only be executed by the owner of the device. And in that silent communion between us and our mobiles, these activities are rendered invisible, certainly to others, but very often to ourselves as well. And yet they're exactly the tasks that enable us to do work everywhere and all the time. So the social entrepreneurs, their work processes are personalized through the use of devices that support activities across the public and personal boundary, making it easier for them to see these Digi-Housekeeping tasks as not work or not real work. For office workers, personalized combining of work and leisure renders the tasks rather ambiguous. They downplay the amount of time spent on it and enjoy the efficiency of using small periods of time for these tasks. And the university students learnt that personalized Digi-Housekeeping tasks can support flexible study, but can only be undertaken by them. And so Anthony talks about, he's a final year doctoral student, about how he'd learnt the value of sorting as a self-driven form of highly personalized Digi-Housekeeping to support his flexible PhD, which he described as not really a Monday to Friday thing, it's more of a whenever you can find time to work on it thing. And he says, one of the most useful things I have for organizing different aspects of my life is having some way of organizing my emails. The way I do this is just to have a bunch of filters in place and tons of different folders here for my personal finances, for the research facility, for where I'm looking for applying for jobs. So this structure is so very specific to Anthony and his various life roles, it couldn't be undertaken by anyone else, and indeed is invisible to anyone else. So the personalization of work processes through Digi-Housekeeping activities makes supporting and executing these tasks only really feasible for the person who set up the infrastructure and that means that the work cannot be shared out, in contrast, of course, to many domestic housework tasks. The third process is work extension. I'm hoping that you've appreciated how plentiful and repetitive these Digi-Housekeeping tasks are. And it isn't just the tasks themselves, it's the mental effort of thinking and planning that they take place. And together, that adds up to quite a lot of extra hours of work that is largely not acknowledged. The social entrepreneurs saw their work extended through time spent on these tasks that were necessary for presenting themselves in a kind of contemporary neoliberal discourse around connectivity and flexibility. They talked so much about the fear of missing out by not being sort of on their phones and monitoring emails and messages pretty much all their waking day. Office workers, their work was extended through flexible work arrangements, which rely on Digi-Housekeeping not being classified as real work, else there wouldn't be sufficient time for the real work to be completed. We had somebody who was doing their annual appraisal in the evening at home, spending an agonizing half an hour trying to get a VPN to work so that she could do that. So she was already doing a work task in the evening, which she resented. But then when the technology that was supposed to enable her to work from home, to enable it, didn't work, she was then troubleshooting that very technology, and is quite eloquent about how annoying that was. And the university students, their work is extended through Digi-Housekeeping, and that has to be accomplished and learnt to be done in a way that maintains professionalism, but obviously behind the scenes involves hours of mundane tasks. And we have a lovely video of Chloe, who was a student with a clothing business while she was still at university, doing a Skype call with a sort of potential business partner, and realizing that her laptop required her to download and reinstall Skype, which had mysteriously disappeared. Which of us have not had that particular occurrence? And she was mortified that she was having to email to explain to these people what was happening. And we thought it was like the digital equivalent of washing your dirty linen in public, because these are things that normally, as I said, are hidden and invisible to others. And Michael also talked about charging devices. He said, one constant thing with keeping gadgets going is making sure they're all charged, or there's a way of charging them, stopping them dying on you. And his sort of life and death analogy sort of reinforces the significance of this preparing task. If you're going to be a connected social entrepreneur, then you have to put the hours in to make sure that that happens. Summarizing, digital technology creates additional tasks which are necessary for the effective functioning of the technology and effective engagement in working flexibly. These three processes, however, work to make the tasks of Digi-Housekeeping invisible and apparently mundane to those who do them. And they blur the boundaries between these tasks and leisure activities, with the outcome that they're not positioned as real work. They are positioned as not real work. But nevertheless, they're experienced as taking time and effort away from actual field work or leisure or family time. And that leads to feelings of work intensification, but without apparent source, because if you think that you've been working, but you can't point at something that is identified by you as work, there's a sort of inexplicable feeling that you're working harder than ever, but you can't point to what it is that is the source. And ultimately, what's happened is necessary work has been displaced onto individual workers without recognition and without recompense. And there's a literature that's beginning to kind of unpack that. So why does it matter? As a first paper to sort of highlight and identify these tasks, just making them visible, highlighting their prevalence and significance is important. And that's, in a sense, our sort of starting point in terms of a contribution. But this goes beyond some of the gender scripts that we see in association with domestic housekeeping. In the study where we had equal numbers of men and women, both men and women carried out Digi-Housekeeping tasks. We did not see any gender differences. And indeed, I think it's much more pertinent to draw on other work that's talked about the way in which modern labour is being housewifized, another lovely word, I'm so sorry, by which labour is devalued. And that encapsulates how tasks which have to be done increase the working day, but the cost of them is not passed on to the employer or the client. And even workers who have yet to enter the workforce, like the student body in our participant group, are pre-disciplined into accepting this. In other words, it could be that men may begin to experience the same undervaluing of their labour as women have done through the gendering of domestic labour. And indeed, if we're all going to be working flexibly forever, we may all be subject to this for some time. So beyond looking at just work-life boundaries, this research interrogates the very nature of what will count as work at all. And I finish by saying, in line with calls for housework to be recognised as labour, I think Digi-Housekeeping should be recognised as labour, because without it, flexible working isn't possible. Thank you.